The triumph of the Venetian method, or what does not want to be exhausted and which cannot begin. Part 3. The establishment of the Jesuit order. The Italian Renaissance summer in Venice was just one of many applications during the 16th century. The other was to promote the Reformation. Martin Luther's immediate directors have already been identified, but that is a secondary thing. Luther's agitation in Wittenberg was just one example of protests against the papacy and the mansion that had been constant and local for decades. The real slap that Luther and the other Protestants gave was the publicity and dissemination of their ideals, which was largely due to the Venetian publishing community. The Venetian printing press quickly printed the writings of Luther, Calvin, Melanchthon, and the main frame, especially popular in Italy, Juan Valdez, in 40,000 copies. Pope Leo X condemned the University of Padua for being a hotbed of the German disease of Lutheranism. The interests of Venice were obviously well served by a divided movement that would stir up Germany, France and the rest of Europe with a series of conflicts that could be easily worked out. The conflict between reformers and counter-reformers, thanks to the loyalty of each of them to Aristotle, would seriously jeopardize the influence of Erasmus and the like. The influence of Venice on both the Reformation and the Counter-reformation can be seen most clearly in the remarkable career of Gasparo Contarini, 1483–1542, who was a Protestant in the theological sense long before Luther. Contarini was a descendant of one of the most prestigious Venetian Longhi, oldest noble, families. The Contradict was given 7 doses to the city, and Gasparo would have been the 8th, but he had become a member of the Cardinal College. He served as the Majestic Republic in the court of Charles V, and as the Vatican envoy, where the Pope Medici, 7. Clement ascended the throne to plunder Rome in 1527. Towards the end of his life, Contarini was the papal legate at the Imperial Assembly in Regensburg, where he represented the Roman position in disputes with dissidents such as Melanchthon. Here he was part of the destruction of all agreements between the Lutherans and Emperor Charles, which could have put an end to the bloodshed and strife of the Reformation. What did this sophisticated Venetian patrician have to do with founding the Jesuit order of the wandering and confused mystic Ignatius Loyola? Ignatius was a creature of Venice, and Contarini in particular. Ignatius was wounded in 1521 when he fought against the French in one of Charles V's wars. During his recovery, he went through a mystical crisis, after which he became a tramp. During his wanderings, he decided to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and went to Venice, where he farmed in St. Mark's Square and lived from begging. One evening, when the Venetian oligarch, Marc Antonio Trevisan, Dose 1553–54, was sleeping in his magnificent palace, he had a dream. An angel came to him and asked, "How can you sleep so peacefully in your soft bed when there's a holy man in the square, a poor pilgrim who needs your help?" Trevisan ran down the stairs and found Ignatius, whom he had invited to his house, along with his fleas. Ignatius was then interrogated by his dog, Andrea Gritti, who offered to take him to Cyprus on the first leg of his pilgrimage to Jerusalem by a Venetian warship. Ignatius continued his journey, but soon returned to Venice and came into contact with other members of the oligarchy. Among them was Gasparo Contarini's nephew, Pietro, who became receptive to Ignatian brainwashing training, spiritual exercises. Ignatius then went to Rome and became the protector of Gasparo Contarini, who had already been admitted to the Cardinals' College by the new Pope. 3. Paul is a member of the Farnese family. The cardinal took over the spiritual exercises and appointed Ignatius as his personal confessor and spiritual counselor. From 1540, Contarini personally intervened with the Pope for Ignatius, who had enemies within the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and allowed the Society of Jesus to be established as a new ecclesiastical order. 3. Pope Paul was a disciple of Julius Pomponius Latus, one of the great admirers and revivers of ancient Rome, Pastor, Jes. D. Pabst, 12. 523. In June 1539, Contarini traveled to the Pope's summer residence, Tivoli, and asked the Pope to read to him the statutes of the new order compiled by Ignatius. The Pope had to be favorably influenced. His affirmative remark was "Hic est digitus de." Here is the finger of God, which became one of the recurring voices of the titled Jesuit rhetoric. In connection, Ignatius of Loyola and the Jesuit order. Already Loyola recognized the role of Contradictions, apparently under the influence of her Venetian benefactors, the Cantarines and the Trevisans, and in one of her letters explicitly writes that many contradictions bear much fruit towards the conscious use of the white principle. The 13th rule of Loyola's spiritual practices is also that if the Church says black is white, it must also be accepted, which, let's face it, is not just anachronism today. Roberto Bellarmino S.J. did good services in the fight against the Reformation. General so-called controversy theology, and the open confrontation was gradually replaced by covert, outsourced, indirect confrontations. The relationship between Loyola and the Spanish Netherlands in Section 7 below, see also Loyola and the Alumbrados, the Spanish Illuminati. The principle of the use of dualities is perhaps the clearest in its wording on Hungarian soil. Joseph Dombey, Jesuit Path Spiritual Practice, in his writing in the 1950s. He summarizes the technique of creating a new world in 3 steps, apparently under the influence of internal, orderly inspirations. The 2 opposing poles, then capitalism and socialism, could ultimately lead to the Catholic Church's world domination of solidarity by neutralizing each other. Second step, the world bankruptcy of opposing forces, 2 separate worlds, not 1 but 2 opposing forces neutralizing each other. Step 3, the pregnant, tired masses on both sides demand international cooperation. Then comes world solidarity, imperialism, world order, world peace. The driving force behind solidarity is the Catholic Church, the organizer of world peace and world order. Julio Cesar Cordera S.J., who acquired the laurels of history, literature and poetry. 1704 to 1785. In his autobiography he expresses some important facts about the Jesuit order and the ban of 1773. Only the Jesuits of almost all the kings and rulers of Europe guarded their consciences, so that the whole of Europe was ruled by the Jesuits alone. Dr. Steiner also quotes from Cordera. I would like to mention a passage from Cordera's memoirs where he notes that it is strange that the Jesuit order was banned in the 14th century. Pope Clement, who really liked the Jesuits and so on. He was an extremely tolerant man at the time, and not a fool. Thus Cordera attributes an excellent character to the Pope, exalting him almost to the heavens, even though he banned the Jesuits. Cordera, of course, asks how it could be that this dear Pope banned them. One has to ask the question, says Cordera, what was the intent of divine wisdom in banning the Jesuits, and why was this allowed? Now Cordera was a Jesuit, but a man who had learned to think logically by them and therefore did not ask abstract questions but very specific ones. He says, let us look at what was to be condemned in the order, and continues, I find that the Jesuit order, in terms of morality, has worked admirably. We are very strict against impurity and the like, no one can deny that. But we are very forgiving about all sorts of things like slander, accusations and misleading. Cordera actually states that God probably allowed the banning of the Jesuit order in 14 by Pope Clement, as a certain tendency to slander, accuse, and deceive gradually infiltrated the order. I am not criticizing this now, I am just telling the facts. I would just like to add that the Jesuit Cordera even mentions, one of our main sins is the arrogance that has led us to regard all other orders as insignificant and the whole secular priesthood as worthless. Now, if one compares everything that is said in these memoirs, not in order to rebuke the Jesuit order, but simply as a kind of mea culpa, As an examination of the conscience of a Jesuit, we find the pursuit of political power in the first place, second, contempt for arrogance, other orders, and secular priests, third is the accumulation of wealth, equals three main Catholic sins, superbia, tyranny, luxuria. But if one gradually realizes that all of this means maintaining dead, withered truths by means of power, one cannot do better than take care of the maintenance of such an order. The Roman Catholic Church 7. At the time of Pius, he knew very well what he was doing. Giving thanks to world history, the history that too. It was done by Frederick, King of Prussia, and Catherine of Russia, who by this time had passed away. They had accepted the Jesuits who had been expelled from several places after 1773, and restored the Jesuit order. End of the reading.